to a friend who, for most of the last 8 weeks or so, has been sort of hashtag loving lockdown. And what she meant by that was that she was enjoying her time at home, her time off work, reading books, taking care of her children, a little bit of DIY and gardening and home baking, walking with her family, all that sort of thing. She felt really more productive, probably less stressed. But of course, she did acknowledge that she was in a very fortunate situation. Not everyone, in fact, perhaps only a very few could say that they were coping well during this pandemic. When somebody asks, of course, we say we're doing fine, but in reality, perhaps we're not. I saw her, at a safe distance, of course, 2 days later, in the middle of this spell of rain that we've been having recently. Up until then, of course, you'll know it's been bright and sunny for most days, but today she was feeling less than hashtag loving lockdown. And jokingly I said to her, you'll feel much better when the sun comes back. Our ability to cope typically depends on stuff like that, on a lot of things going well. Things normally out with our control, like the weather. If we're having to stay in our house cramped together, if we're managing financial stress and worries, it helps when the sun is shining. In fact, our whole well-being, our mood seems inextricably linked sometimes to the weather and to the things that we can't control. And by weather, you could say circumstances. More generally speaking, things go well, we feel well. But it is difficult to ignore the circumstances, and I'm not altogether sure that we should. There's a lot of counsel out there designed to vilify circumstance, make circumstances our enemy, to make us feel weak if we find ourselves tossed about by the weather, to make us feel ashamed if the only boat during the storm that we could find was an old dinghy with holes in it and no bucket. We're, as Christians, perhaps not great disciples of Jesus if we are cowering in the corner of the boat when the storm comes along. And we're certainly not a great Christian if we haven't dared, like Peter, to step out onto the water when Jesus says, come. Circumstances. Flinging open all the windows and doors in the house when it's lashing with rain and blowing a gale might not be the best idea. Working outside all day long in the brutal heat of the sun without some sort of protection might also be ill-advised. Dumb, maybe. Foolish, too, if we've been ignoring our health and the safety of others during this pandemic. Ignoring the circumstances can cause just as many problems as letting them govern our lives or have the better of us, as letting them control or dictate our mood. Glibly, defiantly, deciding sometimes that somehow the circumstances don't apply to us is as equally dangerous, as equally unwise. Even if we find ourselves in a better position than other people, if we've got a nice raincoat and a pair of wellies, if we've got plenty of sunscreen, if we've not had the hint of a cough or one single sign of COVID toe, and even if we're like Peter, after he's gotten his act together, and we think that it's unchristian to stay in the boat when Jesus is calling us, even if we believe that we've got all the faith in the world. Which reminds me of Paul's hymn to love. Begins, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all the mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as even to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. I can have it all and at the same time have nothing. Nothing that really matters. To think only of ourselves is just as poor a response to the crisis as if we were melodramatically falling on the floor, wailing and bawling and stomping our feet every waking moment. Most of us would consider that, whilst perhaps perfectly understandable at times, an immature response. And there is a close link between immaturity and a lack of wisdom. Selfishness is not wisdom. Thinking only of our own well-being is not wisdom. Thinking that everyone else should be like me is not wisdom. No one ever did anything wise without consideration of the impact of their actions on others. If you do anything and you haven't thought about what it will do to others, that is just not wisdom. It's a different kind of action, a different course. Selflessness, sacrifice, consideration of others, compassion, love, they are all an integral part of wisdom. Smart people do not look out for number one. Nowhere in God's word, nowhere in the words of Jesus, nowhere in the actions and in the miracles of Jesus will you find advice that does not consider the consequences of our actions and the impact of our choices on others. In our first few lessons on wisdom, we considered how the wisdom of God was very, very different from the wisdom of the world sometimes. Often, what seems like the right thing to do may not actually be the best choice. God's way of doing things often seems upside down from the alternatives. Why is that? Well, that's just the nature of wisdom. That's what sets it apart from other courses of action and ways of behaving. If we've been selfish all the days of our life, when someone comes along and acts in a selfless manner, that's upside down. That's strange. That's not the way I would have done that. If we've been impulsive and thoughtless with our actions for most of our life, when someone takes the time to consider the consequences and the impact on others, that's a bit strange. That's upside down. That's not the way I would do it. Let me tell you a little bit about the wisdom of Jesus. Jesus told a mother at the worst time of her life, don't cry. And then he brought her son back to life. It's a story that perfectly mirrors that of Elijah and the widow at Nain. You'll find that in First Kings. In fact, the original Greek phrase at the end of the story of Jesus healing the widow's son or bringing back to life the widow's son exactly mirrors what we find in the story of Elijah. When it says Jesus gave him back to his mother, that's an identical phrase used after Elijah's miracle. Now, no wonder the crowds were astonished. They were raised on the Jewish scriptures and taught to revere Elijah as the greatest of all prophets. Everyone who saw or heard about Jesus and the widow of Nain would have made the link with Elijah. But it wasn't simply a copycat miracle. Jesus knew exactly who his audience was. He knew the connection that they would make. He was sending a very clear message, but it wasn't just an advertising campaign either. Hey, I'm the Son of God. Hey, I'm the Messiah. Vote for me. He cared about the woman, and he cared about who was watching. He didn't tell the widow that she was weak. He didn't tell her to get over herself. Pull yourself together, woman. He said, I see your grief, and I'm going to do something about it. He didn't tell the crowds to stop gawking. He brought them in. He brought them close so that they could be a part of what God was doing. No one who ever thought of themselves ever did anything wise. And when Jesus fed the 5,000, similar thing occurred. The people are hungry and they're not going to be in any mood, Jesus, for another sermon until they're fed. Jesus says, all right, we'll stop for lunch. I'm a bit famished too, if I'm honest. Peter, John, you guys go get a pie from Greg's. If there's any kind of change left over, get some chips for yourself. But that wasn't Jesus' response at all, of course. The feeding of the 5,000, perhaps one of the most memorable miracles of Jesus, would have put first century Jews in mind of another towering figure in Jewish history, Moses. Someone even greater than the prophet Elijah. They would have been thinking about the father of the Jewish faith himself. Everything about the miracle, from the setting right down to the smallest of details, would suggest a really powerful identification between Jesus and Moses. When Jesus and his disciples get on the boat, they cross the waters of the Sea of Galilee to reach a place that the Gospels describe as lonely. In fact, they reach a place on the northeast shore of the lake that is so lonely that it's known locally as the desert. How had Moses' journey to the Promised Land begun? Well, first he'd crossed the waters of the Red Sea and then he'd stopped in the Sinai desert. An interesting parallel, but of course that wouldn't be enough to astonish the onlookers. Once they reach the desert, though, Jesus' disciples ask him how 2 loaves and 5 fishes are going to feed such a substantial crowd. When Moses reached the Sinai wilderness, the Hebrew people asked him what on earth they were going to eat. How were they going to survive to sustain them in such a barren landscape? Just before the miracle, Jesus orders the people to sit together in squares of hundreds and 50s. And Moses ordered the Hebrews to sit down in companies of 100 or 50 strong. And in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, Moses is advised by his father-in-law Jethro to select men from all the people who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over the thousands, the hundreds, the 50s, and the tens. At the climax of the story and the miracle itself, Jesus hands out the loaves and the fishes and somehow manages to multiply them so the food goes to everybody who needs it. Back in the Sinai desert, Moses presided over an equally miraculous multiplication of food. In the morning, on the ground, manna, the bread of heaven, like the fall of snow. In the evenings, the skies above the camp were filled with quail, loaves and fishes, manna and quail. The menu might be a little bit different, but the significance of that miracle would not be lost on that first century Jewish crowd. Jesus did not ignore the hunger of everybody who'd come to see him and to hear him. And neither did he ignore their other needs. Not just their physical needs, but he took into account their spiritual needs. And he took into account, again, bringing them close in. He took into account who he was in relationship to them. His whole purpose and every action he took was based on compassion and love, consideration of needs and consideration of the message that he was sending. When lockdown begins to ease, we're going to feel a particular fresh sense of freedom. And there's going to be a lot of temptation to no longer sort of comply and do the things that we know to be right because they're complying with guidance, but to just do what we feel like and perhaps let slip that consideration of others, that consideration and impact of our actions. No one who ever did anything without consideration of others and the impact of their actions ever did anything wise. And we, as believers, we do nothing of value, nothing of any significance, nothing of any meaning without love. God bless you, folks. Stay safe, stay well, stay wise.